Environmental, social and governance considerations have become not only a key focus for regulators and investors, but also a prominent transaction factor and potential value enhancer for dealmakers in the M&A world.
While ESG is often framed in terms of risk and exposure, effective diligence, valuation, and management of ESG factors in each stage of the deal flow can do more than risk mitigation. It can be an important value driver that allows parties to boost synergy and capitalize on ESG opportunities presented by an M&A transaction.
This video explores ESG considerations from the pre-signing diligence to the post-closing integration of an M&A deal.
When evaluating acquisition targets from an ESG perspective, there are some risk factors that an acquirer should consider. Financing. Acquirers should consider the impact of ESG on the costs and availability of financing, both in terms of acquisition financing and the ongoing financing of the acquired business post-acquisition. The cost of capital may effectively increase for businesses who underperform on ESG criteria, as lenders often prefer to lend to greener, more sustainable ventures. Banks' own investors are pressing them to, for example, increase lending to renewable energy and decrease lending to traditional fossil fuels extraction. Accordingly, acquirers may benefit from cheaper financing when pursuing targets and assets that are contributing to a sustainable, progressive, or green economy. Regulatory risk. The evolving ESG regulatory landscape requires companies to keep abreast of the latest ESG standards developed globally and domestically. The broad range of areas subsumed within ESG, including climate and energy, diversity, pay equity, cybersecurity, forced labor, and ethical business practices, means various regulators may exercise jurisdiction and enforce ESG policies. For instance, the SEC has proposed recently a rule that would require domestic and foreign issuers to disclose certain climate-related information in their registration statements and periodic reports. Global businesses are developing reporting tools and procedures that enable them to comply with the patchwork of applicable regimes as the same evolves, and will need to build processes to incorporate newly acquired businesses in their reporting regimes. Investor engagement and ESG activism. Boards and management should pay significant attention to ESG matters in M&A transactions, as they remain a top priority to investors and activists. This trend will likely increase as a growing body of evidence suggests that companies that perform better against ESG criteria tend to have lower cost of capital and greater revenue growth potential. In the context of M&A transactions, boards and management should be prepared to demonstrate how ESG considerations are sufficiently assessed and managed in investor presentations, transaction negotiations, press releases, and at analyst and investor meetings. Unaddressed ESG risks can cause bumps in the road when trying to obtain the required shareholder approvals for a transaction.
Prior to an acquisition or other investment transaction, an acquirer should have a good understanding of the target's ESG profile to assess the accretive or dilutive impact of such transaction on the combined company's aggregate ESG profile. In the initial target identification process, the threshold question that an acquirer would typically consider, i.e. the strategic fit of the relevant target or assets, is relevant in the ESG context as well. Some relevant things for an acquirer to consider in this regard include: does the target's business and culture seem to be compatible with the acquirer's? Is the target's industry one that is perceived to have significant environmental concerns? Does the target operate in a region that's known for a high incidence of bribery and corruption? From sellers' perspective, the ability to define a price that is competitive and backed by a satisfactory ESG profile may be crucial in order to convince shareholders to approve the deal. From a buyer's perspective, perhaps the buyer views the ESG profile of a target as a key reason to do the deal, because the target's profile will give the buyer an uplift in terms of its ESG profile. As a starting point, on the screen is a list of general questions related to each dimension of ESG. It's worth noting that ESG-focused diligence is not a one-size-fits-all exercise, and this set of questions only serves as a starting point, and the ESG diligence should be carefully tailored to the target's industry, business model, and geographies in each transaction. The ESG findings will be key to understanding what contractual provisions the acquirer may wish to bargain for in the acquisition agreement, and the financial impact of any integration costs and synergies post-closing.
The acquirer should negotiate the representations, warranties, covenants, and/or other provisions in the transaction documents to address the identified ESG findings and allocate risk between the parties to the extent the sale process and competitive dynamics allow. During the recent M&A boom, because sellers had significant leverage and many transactions were conducted via competitive auction, it is our experience that many acquirers were not successful in specifically addressing ESG risks in the purchase agreement, beyond what is traditionally addressed by standard contractual provisions. We also suspect that in insured deals, because insurers may be reluctant to underwrite non-traditional representations and warranties, bespoke ESG reps are less likely to become part of standard market practice. However, as the M&A boom slows and more leverage is returned to buyers, we expect the tide might change and buyers might be more successful in obtaining ESG protections in the acquisition agreement.
Representations and warranties. A standard representations package covering legal and regulatory compliance, environmental compliance, and employee matters will offer acquirers some protection as they overlap with the ESG imperatives. However, acquirers may also consider broadening these representations and requesting that they cover more specific ESG risks, such as compliance with internal ESG policies or specific standards that the target is undertaken to voluntarily comply with, including standards set by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. Sexual harassment misconduct, the so-called Weinstein Clause. Social labour, health and safety, security or environmental incident, accident or circumstance regarding business and operations that could have a material adverse effect. Any specific ESG concerns identified in the due diligence process, for which special indemnities may also be arranged.
Covenants. Other provisions to consider include interim covenants to buttress supply chain accountability or to address stakeholder accountability, or covenants requiring the target to rectify any known issues and to advance its ESG capabilities up to the acquirer's standards. Conditions. If a buyer has significant leverage, it may attempt to make a deal contingent on the target meeting certain ESG criteria between signing and closing. This puts the onus on the seller to ensure the target has met the buyer's ESG compliance requirements as of closing, rather than buyer having to spend resources doing so post-closing. But in most cases, sellers will likely resist conditioning their deal on this.
Following closing, having a detailed roadmap of changes to be implemented based on ESG diligence facilitates the integration period and minimises the potential risk of continued misconduct that could give rise to legal and reputational harm post-acquisition. The acquirer should ensure that appropriate ESG policies and reporting of an equivalent scope and standard are implemented by the target, communicated effectively to the relevant stakeholders, and enforced by management. To expedite the transition process, acquirers may consider establishing ESG KPIs for management where appropriate, including integrating ESG metrics into performance measures, performance targets, and vesting conditions. This is an increasing trend we are seeing in the market.